Okay, welcome everybody to my first State of the Genre discussion today on religion and religious conflict in fantasy and other speculative fiction. And because talking to myself is very boring, I have 5 fantastic people here. And if I can briefly ask you to introduce yourself, and we might start with P.L. Stuart. If you briefly tell us who you are.
Well, thank you so much. Honored to be here, Angela, and with these esteemed guests. I'm P.L. Stuart. I'm the author of the Drowned Kingdom Saga. I'm also a blogger, and I love books. I love reading, and religion in fantasy is a theme that I am fascinated with and have been for a very long time. So I'm very excited to discuss this and learn from the minds collected here. There's a lot of great collective brain power literally throbbing in this discussion. So I'm very excited to chat to you all about this topic today.
Thank you. AP.
Hello, I'm AP. My YouTube channel is A Critical Dragon. As a freelance editor, my PhD is in fantasy literature, and I grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. So religion is an interesting topic, particularly when it's depicted in a fantasy setting. So I'm greatly looking forward to this. So thanks.
You probably don't need the fantasy, you lived it in a way. And Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura. My channel is called Fantasy Awash. I have a master's in religion and history, so this is definitely something that I love to talk about. Fantasy is my preferred genre, if it's not clear from my channel name. Hoping to be an author in the next coming year. I just finished my first draft of my first book, so hopefully I can say that I will be an author next time we have a conversation. Definitely have religion in my story, as I know other beautiful authors do here, and I am happy to talk about it with everybody.
Okay, thank you. Holly.
Hi, I'm H.L. Tinsley. I am an author of Grimdark and urban fantasy. My Vanguard Chronicle series, the first 2 books are out in that. So the first one was We Men of Ash and Shadow, and the second is The Hand That Cast the Bone. Currently working on the 3rd one, and earlier this year, in fact last month actually, I brought out my new standalone novel, The Hallows, which is a grim noir, which I'll attempt to hold it the right way up this time, is actually this one here. And a big part of this book is the power structure within the city of the book. It's all very based in kind of religion and like a, I want to say corporate religion, but I'll explain more as we go on, and hopefully it will make more sense.
Okay, and last but definitely not least, Philip.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me here, Angela, along with all these lovely people. And oh no, my nemesis strikes again. Oh, yes, okay.
Okay, 2 Philips. Now I have to figure out, am I actually talking to the right Philip here?
Yeah, I know it's very difficult to tell the difference, but yeah.
I can always get one of the unicorns, and that will be able to sniff out who's the right Philip.
Definitely. So, but yes, I am Philip Chase, and I have a YouTube channel all about fantasy, but I also have I self-published my trilogy last year, the Edan trilogy. PL's got a copy of the first book there, and I have it kind of over my shoulder there. The Way of Edan is book 1. And indeed, the premise, the setting, if you will, of the trilogy is a holy war. So it is obviously a topic that is of great interest to me. And so I'm excited to be here and to learn, and hopefully I'll be able to contribute a thing or two.
Yeah, I'm sure you will, because this is why I thought I'll invite you all, because I'm definitely not an expert on religion. On literature, yes, religion, not so much. But I have the feeling that almost every book I've recently picked up features religion in some way or form. And also most of them feature some type of holy war. And I started to wonder, is this me? Do I pick them that way? Or is there actually a trend at the moment going on? I have really no idea. But when I did my roundup video about 10 books that feature holy war, I got, like in my intro, I said that it amazes me how we humans can actually, turn something that's meant to be a force for good and something where, that a lot of people find consoling and meaningful to them, how we are able to turn this into the total opposite. And I got a comment saying, well, why are you so amazed and so surprised? That's what we humans are. That's human. No? Is that the explanation? Is this why we need this in fantasy? Because we're human?
I think so.
Okay, discussion over.
I mean, humans, even though we evolve in terms of technology and our advancements, in terms of our base, we haven't really changed all that much. I always tell people, I'm like, please go read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you will see how humans really haven't changed in thousands of years. And it's always so funny to me when people think that religion will be a really accepted thing just because it's part of our everyday life. Even when you look at particular denominations of faith, if you want to look at Christianity, for example, the Bible is used widespread throughout Christianity, but there are different forms of the Bible. There's the Catholic Bible, the Orthodox Bible, you have the Ethiopian Bible, like they're using different books. So that alone can cause conflict. And it's always interesting to see where people kind of draw their line with religion.
Yeah.
And I think there's some framing that may perhaps need to take place when we raise the topic of religion. And I think I know for myself, I personally make the distinction between religion and faith. And I've spoken about this previously, including on Philip's channel, actually, the last time we spoke, in that I define faith as that relationship between the person and their deity or deities, however you'd like to describe it. And I define religion as almost like the trappings, including the hierarchy, the clergy that surrounds the faith. So if you think of an egg, perhaps religion is the white and the yolk is your faith. And I think one can definitely exist without the other. There's people who are extremely spiritual and faith-based. However, they're not religious. They don't attend the church, the synagogue, the mosque. And also there are people who are both. They're extremely spiritual and faith-based, and they're also religious. And of course, there are people who nominally they are religious, and unfortunately, there may be an absence of the actual faith and actual belief that their use of religion is something different and not necessarily faith-based. And I think for me, that milieu, now we're straying into where what fascinates me is when religion itself, and Gally, you talked about the force for good, where I believe that predominantly and not exclusively that the things get perverted and twisted when the religion, and especially different people in the hierarchy, when they twist and use faith and religion as a force for not so good. And I think that's probably the biggest element of when we consider religion and fantasy and how that's explored in literature. That's what fascinates me, and I've seen that explored a lot in a lot of fantastic books, including some by specifically H.L. and Philip down there. So yeah, that's the part that I think there is important to me, that delineation. And as mentioned by Fantasy Awash, that even within religions there is conflict, interdenominational conflict within the different religions. So, and that's something that also is explored frequently in literature that I also find fascinating.
Yeah, I actually like that imagery of the egg with the yolk being the face and the white then being the, how should I say, the more institutionalized parts of religions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with PL. I think you said it really well. And another book I would add to the mix is A Drowned Kingdom, where you do see a really wonderful exploration of the tendency for us to be very sympathetic toward our own in-group And this is the thing about religion as an institution, as PL has defined it. Every institution that we create is a reflection of humanity. And humanity has a tendency to be very supportive and loving toward those that we perceive to be in our in-group. And oftentimes, not always, because you can give many examples of religion being supportive of people outside of the in-group. But oftentimes, religion has been used as a sledgehammer against those who are not in the in-group, those who are outside of us, as we define us. And Drowned Kingdom does a beautiful job of exploring that dynamic. And I'm sure it's something that PL will continue to do in the rest of the series. But yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that definition, that religion as an institution is something that reflects our flaws and also what we're capable of. It does reflect many times our capacity for love and empathy. And at the same time, it reflects our destructiveness and our tendency to otherize and persecute. So it's just an incredible. Humans are paradoxical, that is for sure. And religion as an institution that springs from us is going to reflect that paradox.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too. Sorry if I'm interrupting you.
Go ahead.
Tell me to stop. I think it's interesting too, just speaking for myself. I grew up in Montreal, and Montreal is deeply rooted in French Catholicism and has since started to migrate more towards being a secular society and has a much more higher atheist population than it does Catholic population. And to the point where Montreal actually started taxing the church. They're one of the few places on earth that actually taxes the church. And it's been so interesting to see in fantasy literature. I feel like from the last 10 years or so, we're starting to see a lot more stories where the religion is not actively present, but it's something that's lingered in the background. It's fading into obscurity, and the ramifications and effect from what that faith has instilled in a people are what now is being grappled with. And I feel like that's so reflective of so many modern day societies as well. If we look at a lot of the Scandinavian countries, we see a lot of that happening there as well. So it's just really interesting if we can look at all aspects of religion and we see them pretty much all present within fantasy. Like it's present at every stage of our religious journey as humans. And I think that's so inclusive and fascinating.
That's fascinating that you say that Canada is one of the few states that tax religions. Would be the same in Germany. And also, if you are belonging to a religion, the church itself kind of like will tax you, so to say. So you have to pay a tax to the church as well. So yeah. So you have to be quite convinced to actually stay in the club to keep paying the money, so to say.
I also want to note, I'm also Canadian, born and raised in Toronto. It's fascinating that and I'm come to you from Barrie, Ontario. It's interesting in Canada when we talk about religion. And I explore this as well, kind of inspired by in my works. In Toronto, and I'm not sure anymore about Quebec, Laura, that we do have separate religious school boards, the Catholic school board, for example, that operates independent of the publicly funded school board. However, the Catholic school board receives funding from various levels of government to exist, and that is somewhat controversial still here in especially in Ontario. But I think in Canada, one of the things that I believe that attitudes towards religion in general and all faiths and non-faiths has really changed and evolved over the years here. And I think one thing that comes to mind is why the religion itself, and this is all religions. And I want to, again, preface this by saying I'd like to probably speak for all of us. We're all people who respect all faiths and non-faiths. So this isn't a criticism of any one particular religion or faith or, however, in Canada, we have, unfortunately, for all I think Canada is one of the greatest countries in the world. Of course, I'm proud to be Canadian. That said, we do have a rather horrific history in terms of religion and what we have enacted as a society against particular Indigenous population. And the legacy, especially of the residential school system in Canada, whereby the government essentially and the Christian churches enacted mass genocide essentially on the Indigenous people of Canada, and forced children into religious schools, whereby essentially the attempt was to eradicate Indigenous culture, eradicate Indigenous faith, spirituality, reprogram those children to essentially be Christian. And this is something I explore for those who have read my work, and probably down the line as Philip has read A Drunk Kingdom, and Holly has read several of my books, in that in the context of Canada, it wasn't enough to simply convert Indigenous children for the hierarchy, the religious clergy. It was a case of, as I said, they felt the need to eradicate Indigenous spirituality and faith as if it never existed at all. And this is typically a playbook that we see with, this is tied to colonialism, with colonial empires. Name your empire. That's the playbook. Come in, subjugate, eradicate, overlay your culture, religion over top of the others. And in many cases, this is seen as for the good of the other cultures, because you know best, of course, as the dominant culture. And so this is something that's played out certainly in more modern, when I talk about Canada and the relationship with the Indigenous people of Canada and the residential school genocide, essentially, in particular. And I'm sure Laura probably has a lot to say about that as well. But we've seen this replay throughout history, time and time again, and unfortunately some abhorrent ways. So
yeah, it seems to be a feature of colonialism that some of the things that are targeted first is religion. No? I mean, I live in Ireland. AP grew up in Northern Ireland, and it's exactly that model that you described, PL, no? That the colonializing force brings along its religion and then tries to kind of like, suppress whatever is there in indigenous religions. No? Yeah.
Very much so. I mean, if you look at who was being sent out first, it was always missionaries, right? And so it's not surprising that the first thing that was going to be tackled was conversion and faith, and trying to eradicate not only their faith, but their culture, because faith and culture are inherently intertwined in so many parts of the world. It's embedded in our language, our food, our clothing. So yeah, I completely agree with everything PL was saying in terms of Canada's history with Indigenous schools and Indigenous people. It's really come to light in the last few years only. So it's been a really horrific stain on Canada's history, just because so many of us didn't even know that this had taken place, which is absolutely terrible. But the thing that's so troubling to me is that humans used to be so much more accepting of different faith and tradition. Like if you look back several thousand years ago at the Romans, for example, anytime they would go into a new city that they had conquered, so I mean, they weren't that great, like let's just call it what it is, but they would have this procedure of going into the patron deity's temple, and they would say, would you like to come to Rome? And of course they said yes, and that deity became incorporated into the Roman pantheon. But because they did this, it allowed those people to maintain their faith, their culture, a connection to who they were, even though they now paid a tax and tithe to the Roman Empire. They still maintained that part of their personhood, and that really changed with the course of Christianity really being the face of the Western world, and like we were saying, in terms of just missionaries being sent forward in the world. So there is this shift that we have in terms of our mentality with being accepting and degrading to other people. And it's a very monumental shift. And I feel like it's not only represented in our history, but our literature, because there is a very significant shift on how we discuss religion and faith and demons and all sort of aspects of that really takes place in the Middle Ages and then kind of seeped into our fantasy writing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look how how widespread religion is and still is for us today, even so we say that we are living mostly in very secularized societies, and that our, let's say, Western model of democracy, of course, also insists that religion and the state are separated. But it still seems to be very prominent in some respects. And if we think about fantasy as something that mirrors our own world, our own life, or is a commentary on our life, then it might not be perhaps though surprising that we find so many fantasy works where we also find religion.
Well, there's an interesting thing, I think, in how religion is being used in fantasy, whether it is a literalization of an abstract ideal. So you have the literal personification, Ares and Mars, physically being present and interacting with the world. Or you have a lot of the fantasy religions being basically stealing inspiration from mythology and then writing a fantasy version of the mythological construct outside of the context of what that mythology was, which was a religion. That there's a separation between religion and mythology in the minds of a lot of the authors who are using it. And then there's even a focus on using religion as a stand-in for a signal of in-group, that religion is one way of grouping a set of people together, and it is used simply as that, as a narrative function. It's creating the group rather than a national identity. It's the religious identity, because that can be used to complicate or deconstruct certain alliances or relationships between the different factions within any narrative setup. So when we talk about religion and real world religions, and what real world religions have done, have clearly inspired and influenced a lot of these things. But we can't forget that there's also the position that there are a lot of real world religions that are now regarded as mythologies, and therefore fair game to just, oh, well, I'm just going to take all of this stuff and I'm going to put it in my fantasy world, and I'm not offending anyone. Whereas if you did that with one of the major modern day religions, certain people could get very, very offended that you've treated their religion as a mythological construct. And yet we go, oh, I'm going to write a book on Norse mythology because, yeah, that's all fine. We don't refer to Christian mythology in the same way. So it's interesting because so many of the, particularly fantasy in the 1980s and 1990s, you had a very widespread use of pantheistic sort of constructs of religion. And it's, here's the god of war, here's the god of death, here's the god of taxes, here's the god of hangovers. Or sorry, Pratchett had that as the god of hangovers. And it was a useful way of creating a sense for particularly a Western audience of an almost orientalized fantasy past. Oh, this is what people used to believe in the past, because it ignores the fact that there are modern day religions that are pantheistic, but not in the way that they're created by a lot of authors from Western Christianized nations and their belief about pantheons.
Yeah.
That's so, first of all, I would love to know of a society that has the god of hangovers. I think that would be a great place to be. But
Ireland.
There you go. But what's so interesting when you
definitely
talk about
candidate.
mythologies versus our current faiths, like so many of our modern religions, if you look at the Abrahamic religions, for example, share the same stories as a lot of our defunct religions. Like if you look at the story of the Ark and the flood, that's present in Egyptian mythology, Sumerian, Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Judaic, like it's prevalent, but we disregard the others because those peoples aren't currently advocating for it. So it's fair game. So I just thought that was very poignant.
Yeah, and it is curious that the vast preponderance of major religions, I would argue, preach, at least certainly their main texts, they preach peace, love, tolerance, loving your neighbor, being a good person, quote unquote what you define that as. And yet we see that, and this is where I go back to the difference between religion and faith, is that typically it is us as flawed humans, as we've talked about, and flawed humans essentially running the institution that is the religion, that turned that into something, horrendous, right? Be it things like the Spanish Inquisition, etc. The Crusades, it is taken, and despite when you break it down to brass tacks, and the faith advocating for peace, it's some of them almost to the point of the extreme of like pacifism. However, it's used in all these very brutal ways, including holy wars, which is what I think, Angela, one of the big themes here, that somehow how do we get from love thy neighbor to well, because thy neighbor does not believe as we believe, we need to kill them and subjugate them so that they believe what we believe, because we know the right way. And that's a big stretch, a big leap that somehow we as humans always seem to be able to transition to without much effort.
Yeah, but then once we've converted them, we've saved them, and we've saved them for all of eternity. And that's the really important thing, because otherwise they'd all be going to some sort of dark or cold or hellish place. And therefore, it's important. And why aren't they welcoming us with open arms and realizing that we're doing the right thing for them? Right. Well, if we kill all of those ones, but we did it for the right reason. Humans are very, very good at projecting using self-rationalization for,
yes.
Oh, well, that's a very interesting country. I'd quite like all of their land and resources.
Which is so fascinating too. If you look at kind of what we were saying earlier, that transition happens when we start ascribing an afterlife that is better, right? Like when you look at a lot of our Western ancient religions, the afterworld was terrible. Being dead was miserable. No one wanted that. And you then started having this introduction of the idea that there could be something better. And that initially started with the Egyptian goddess Isis saying, if you come through me, my husband here, Osiris, he's going to hook you up afterwards and it's going to be great. And then the Christians caught onto it and were like, this sounds like a great idea. We should tell everybody about this. But you can only believe this one. This is the caveat. It's this. And it became inclusive, but the afterworld was terrible. And then it became singular, but there was a promise of better. And I love seeing this in literature too. I love seeing the influence of this in literature, and in ancient literature, especially if you look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, like I mentioned before, they do talk to people that have died, and they tell them like, "Don't come here. This is the worst place to be." History is directly linked to religion and influences our religious texts, our religious history, and then that seeps into our modern day literature and writing.
Yeah, let me ask perhaps the writers on the panel here. You all decided to somehow feature religion and also religious war. What was the motivation for you? And also, what is a religious war giving you as a scenario, a narrative strategy in a book that a normal war wouldn't have achieved for you?
So I'll jump in here because I'm aware I haven't really said anything yet, although I have been learning a lot. This is great. I think just to jump on one of the things that PL said just a moment ago about, looking at things that happen and why we keep getting to these places and why, these religious wars happen, or these, the genocides that have been mentioned happen. And I think what we've done in this conversation so far is we've talked about faith, which is the individualist element of religion. It's the external, the connection that a person has with their God or deity or what they believe in. And we've talked about the institution, which is the organizational side of it, en masse as a whole. And I think what often gets missed is those nuances in the middle, to look at it as also as a power structure where there are groups and pods of individuals, and ask, who are the people at the top? Who are the people that are decision making? Because there is a huge amount of nuance and intricacy within those power structures themselves. And, you know, it's not a case of, you know, one religion says, well, we don't like this other religion, so we're going to go to war with them. You know, there are a million different factions and individuals that feed into that and drive it. So in terms of when I sat down to write a book, I never went in with the intention of saying, I'm going to look at religion, I'm going to talk about religion. I went in with the intention of talking, about faith on the individual level for each character, but also the power structure and how those individuals fit in and how they find their purpose and their position within it. And then when that changes for the negative or for the positive, how do they then react to that? You know, how does a religion that is 1,000 years old react to a world that is evolving and leaving them behind? You know, do they adapt? Do they stay the course and remain true to exactly what they've been doing for 1,000 years at the risk of, you know, losing their lifestyle or, you know, losing their lives? You know, how does that, I've lost the thread of where I'm going now. But yeah, it was never so much me sitting down and saying, okay, I want to create a religion, I want to talk about a religion. It was me wanting to talk about how those emotions and how those actions play out in that New World scenario. And it's something I think we've seen in other power structures as well. So I think we talk about religion being very popular in fantasy at the moment, but I don't know that it is necessarily because people have sat down and thought, you know, let's use religion, that's a great way to tell a story. I think it's just simply another power structure, and really you could apply the same emotions, the same actions, the same stories to systems of government, to fiefdoms, to warring tribes, you know, to kingdoms. It's the challenges that these characters come across, the questions they have to ask themselves, and the moral quandaries are very similar across all these different scenarios. So yeah, that was kind of how I came at it.
Yeah, very, very interesting actually that you say that, yeah, the emotions that faith might evoke were more at the center of it than religion as such, and then the power structures or struggles that then might ensue out of that. Philip, what about you? What do you think that, yeah, having a religious war as a narrative strategy, what that brings to your books?
Yeah, I'd like to build off of what HL just said very eloquently, and also some things that Laura was talking about earlier. My trilogy is very much inspired by the period in Europe, let's say Dark Ages, when you had a monotheistic faith that was being spread fairly aggressively through cultures that had previously been polytheistic. And you see these differences, and I'm really fascinated by the differences in mindset between these things. And the idea that Laura mentioned earlier, the idea of an afterlife where things are going to be wonderful, really does let you justify a lot of things. We have seen that in the world. But at the same time, I completely agree with HL in the sense that within a particular religion, and we're talking about the institution now, within a particular religion, you have all kinds of different people with different motives, with different ways of behaving. So I have, just to give simple examples, I have a character in my trilogy who is a true believer, who is an absolute true believer, will sacrifice anything, including other people, but also himself, in order to promulgate this faith that he believes it is his divine mission to promulgate. And I don't question that he's completely sincere in that. And I have another character who's much more cynical, who wants to use that religion in order to gain political power. Another character who is a believer but has doubts. Is this really the right way for us to be going forward, to be spreading our faith? Is violence the way to spread a religion that is fundamentally about love? Then I have other characters who, are within the ranks of this religion, who view it somewhat cynically as a path to power. So within the religion, you have, and there are also, by the way, examples of individuals within the monotheistic faith who are real virtuistic, just wonderful people who are there to help, who are there to love their neighbors and serve. And so you can find the full array within any given religion. And it's the power structure, I think, that within any institution where you begin to have a serious potential for abuse, because there is so much power there. It's going to attract people who are ambitious and not very sincere. But also, even for the people who are sincere, who are real believers, their potential to do harm is absolutely magnified by this powerful institution that has tentacles all over the place. So exactly, and AP has just written a really cool note in the chat. In institutions as methods of social control. So I'll let him elaborate on that, but that's a beautiful way to put it.
Well, no, I was giving you that phrase so that you could continue to talk about it.
So I could look smart. Thank you.
Well, if you want to control a population and you go, right, your life sucks at the minute, but if you live according to these rules that we give you, your afterlife's going to be awesome. So I can treat you really badly in the meantime, and then you'll get rewarded afterwards. But also things like making the eating of certain foods, and you go, right, you're not allowed to eat that food. That's sinful to eat that food. That's an unclean food. And well, by any chance, are the foods on that list the ones that can give you very severe stomachache, food poisoning, and can kill you if they are prepared badly or was spoiled very, very quickly? Oh, it just so happens that's a convenient list. But by phrasing it, if you say to someone, oh, you shouldn't eat that because you could get sick. Oh, well, I'm not going to get sick from it. I'm strong and healthy and blah, blah, blah. And you shouldn't eat that because it'll damn your soul to hell, or it'll damn your soul in the afterlife. Well, do I really want to chance it for a bit of bacon? There are ways of manipulating a populace with these forms of social control that we do through organization. But the fervor that we feel for it can map just as easily onto national identity or a corporate identity or whatever tribal group or structure that we are using to signal our allegiance. And it's just, with religion, you have the added benefit that quite often you don't have to personally deliver on any of these promises, because quite often you can shuffle the payment off after the person has died. And, well, and they can't come back and go, hang on a sec, that was all terrible. I lived my whole life according to these things, and there wasn't, the pearly gates. People don't come back and argue. So it was, I think, one of the best ways that was ever invented to manipulate populations. And some of the most successful businesses of all time have been religions. Like the Roman Catholic Church is possibly the most successful corporation that has ever existed. Still going strong after all these years.
So Max was right. Religion is opium for the masses.
Yeah. I think we're forgetting too, though, we're talking about institution in terms of the people at the top, but we're forgetting about the communal aspect. And that is such a lure for so many people, especially people who are going through a period of isolation or depression. Having a sense of community and belonging is something that can be so invaluable to people. And what binds them is this shared faith and belief. And I mean, if we're going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of these promises that were being given to people, Christianity was referred to initially as a slave religion because the earliest converts were slaves, because their lives were abysmal and they were being given the promise of something so much grander and better, to the point where these people would slave literally all day and then come together in the evenings in like caves and worship together. And it bound people with this tie that you only understood if you were part of that group. It's that inness, it's that connectedness. And it's something that we still see in our current societies. If people immigrate or move to a new country, the first thing a lot of people do is they either seek out people of their same nationality or their faith because they want that connectedness. So yes, religion is being used from this institutional level in terms of people at the top, but it's also a lure at its base level in terms of just friendship and community and time. So as a whole, it's just very layered.
I think there's an interesting point actually that I would like to kind of jump on from that, is that one of the reactions that I've had, and I don't know if maybe PL and Philip have experienced this as well, is that when I've put out a book that has like a religion at its core, a lot of the reactions from people reading that is to say, okay, so the religion, that's the bad guy. So this is the enemy, which was never the intention when I wrote it. So when I wrote the book, I wanted to show, as we've mentioned, the nuances, so that there are, good individuals, there are bad individuals, there are good ideas, there are bad ideas. There's all these different layers to it. Yet what's interesting to me is that the things people hone in on as a readership, as an audience, are the negatives. So within the Hallows, for example, we have these nuns who are very proactive in the community, and they are very giving, they're very generous, they're very open, and they are really generous characters who live life the way that they believe is morally right. Yet because they are a part of this system that has these flaws and these faults and these kind of more morally questionable sides to it, they become a part of that kind of negative entity. And it's really interesting to see that reaction, because when I actually talked to people before writing it, the majority of people I spoke to were talking about the joy that they have in their faith, and the comfort that they get from it, and that sense of community that we've just mentioned. So I think when people look at it, I think it depends very much on, honestly, like their own perspective. It is partially their own perspective, but I think it's also that kind of wider society can't speak now perspective of what religion is. And I'm interested to see if like Philip and PL have had that same kind of reaction.
Go ahead, PL.
Oh, thank you, Philip. Well, I think for one thing, of course, with my books, my protagonist is someone who is staunchly a religious zealot, and a religious zealot as part of a very monotheistic religion. So I think for me, people tend to hone in on the character and his flaws with that zealotry, rather than per se the faith that he espouses. Because I know that in my books, what I try to present in my books is that, again, I talked about this religion versus faith, that the other religions represented in my books, and even the characters' religion, the issue isn't with the faiths. The issue is with the people, and how they choose to manipulate the religions in the name of the faith, but typically for their own purposes. And although, as I can't remember who pointed out, that my character is well-meaning and someone who absolutely voraciously believes in what he's doing, and that what he's doing is the right thing, we all as the readers can see what the issues are. And that we can all see what the issues are when, to a fault, you believe that because of your faith, this is the right way, and you have in his case, a God-given responsibility to make sure that everyone believes what you believe. So I think the reaction for me is more about the character's zealotry and his bigotry and his religious intolerance towards other faiths. And when he is exposed to different faiths and perhaps slowly starting to be educated and seeing the virtues perhaps of other faiths, will he dogmatically stick to his beliefs? Will he change? Will he evolve? So I think for me, most of the reaction is more about, in my case, the character rather than anything else.
Yeah. For me, it's a little different. I would say I have come across some readers who kind of just equate, so this is a monotheistic religion trying to take over. You mean Christianity, right? And I'm like, well, no, actually, this is a fictional religion. I don't mean Christianity. I do mean to explore something that has happened several times in human history, And it is true that the monotheistic faiths have been some of the more aggressive ones, let's say, within human history. So that's just, though, I think what I'm trying to explore isn't necessarily applying to one religion in particular. I'm looking at where belief comes from, where doubt comes from. I'm looking at fundamentalism, let's say, and maybe trying to explore the consequences. But I'm definitely not just trying to criticize one particular religion, because I don't think any religion has a monopoly on the hate or atrocities. Unfortunately, you can find examples within any religion of these things. So I'm interested in finding out how that happens. How is it that a person who can be very loving in one facet of their life can be very hateful in another facet of their life? How is that possible within one brain to function that way? What brings that about, that behavior? That's what I'm interested in. So that's everywhere. That's universal. And this is a fictional religion. So,
well, Philip, like I could say to you, how is it that you can present yourself as so charming and affable and wonderful, and yet still be the ultimate evil nemesis? Like you are truly, you are both at the same time.
Exactly.
It all depends on who you're talking to and whether or not you value them. And our otherization of individuals, cultures, ideologies, relationships and loyalties that people have. We are so willing to extend the benefit of the doubt to those that we have included in whatever in-group we have constructed.
Yeah.
And we are so willing to castigate and criticize and otherize and dehumanize people on the outside of whatever we've created. And because very few of our beliefs are rational, coherent, and consistent, that leads to wildly inconsistent approaches to any sort of behavior. But I think part of the issue that perhaps that the three authors here have experienced is the fact that media literacy and literacy in general has, let's not say tanked, but there has been a decrease in the ability to understand and appreciate nuance, that we've moved into a very fast-paced, overt, blatant, and blunt form of narrative that people want. What is the gist? What is the head note? What is the bumper sticker version? Just give me the 5 selling points of this novel. That it all has to be boiled down into its most reductive, simplistic form. Because of that, it has become overly reductive, and it has become simplistic rather than simplified. And I think that is an issue where even when we talk about symbols and they go, what does this symbol mean? As if there is only one meaning that can be attributed to it. And you go, well, an argument for one of the interpretations of this symbol could be, is how, we talk about it. But then you'll have someone say, this means death. This means happiness. This, as if it is definitive, absolute, concrete. And we no longer have not only an appreciation, I think, in general for the nuance of subtleties and complications and contradictions within things, but we have an active rejection of those things in favor of, no, but I want it clear cut. I want it explained. And if I can see this link, that is what it must mean, that there is no other possible interpretation. And so I really do think there's an aspect of this. And we see it with people trying to interpret something that may have been inspired by 4 separate nations and time periods. But because they know one of them, they go, oh, well, this is clearly an analog for, or this is an articulation of this one thing. Because they don't know about the other ones. And it's that certainty in basically a place of, and I mean this non-pejoratively, a place of ignorance is in lack of knowledge of. And so we are so unaware of what we do not know that we stand confidently on an opinion going, this is definite. And yet we don't know enough yet to point to whoa, there's a whole load of other stuff here. And that is, particularly with online discourse, media discourse, narrative discourse, all sorts of approaches to this. This has become a very dominant mode of discourse, particularly online, in that a desire for simplified, to the point of simplification or oversimplification, reduced in complexity to the point of overly reductionist in approach, and blatant and overt, because no one wants that subtlety. They want the surety of knowing.
I wonder though if that's new, just because I agree in a lot of what you were saying, but I do think that there is blind faith, and that's something that has existed for so long that people just want to believe what they're told. I used to be a teacher and I taught religious studies, and I was teaching Eastern religions, and I had students that didn't know that there was another faith other than Christianity in 2020. It's one of those things that you kind of don't want to question what it is that you've been told your whole life. And in terms of what people were saying to HL, I feel like we so heavily just rely on what it is we've been told and what we've experienced, that in terms of Philip's story, we're going to automatically associate it to what has been brought into our purview and our bubbles. So many people do not feel comfortable going beyond those boundaries because it puts them in a position where they have to question their faith. And people don't like to do that. There, you will have the odd person who really does like to question their faith and go research others and do compare and analysis. But I knew people that would say, I'm not reading it unless it's pastor approved. And I go, then you're missing out on a lot of stuff in the world. Like, you're getting a very small sample size of what there is to offer. So I think it's a combination of both of those things.
But there's also the issue that reading and literacy in general, and the ability to have critical thought and abstract thought, and even hold two completely different readings in your head at the same time, that's a developed skill. And it has nothing to do with what faith someone has or the level of faith that they have. That media literacy, even when it's not speaking about a particular religion, when it's not using religion specifically. So faith is not a compounding factor in the understanding of what is happening on the page. That's something that has been mapped and has been shown to be in decline. But I think in periods, I would hypothesize that in periods of high social stress or high financial stress within societies, there are fallback positions, and those faith is one of them. That
Definitely.
When you feel under siege, there is this retraction to a reactive position that is conservative in terms of worldview. And with the advent of the internet, with the advent of mobile phones, we were lied to in that, we have access to everything in the world now, all human knowledge. And yet, because of that, the lack of curiosity to find out about these things. And it's, I'll just type it in and it will give me the answer. Look at student attitudes to AI. Why do I need to know this? I'll just ask the AI. But you're not going to know whether or not the AI gave you a good answer. Well, it doesn't matter. I just need the grade. The focus on the material sort of product has actually damaged things. It's reduced curiosity. It has reduced the ability to critically think. It has reduced our interest in complexity. We want to know where the clear lines are. And I think in times of social stress, in times of social pressure, that potentially is more prevalent. At least I would guess.
Yeah, and I think that leads me to the point of, what inspired me to write my books the way I did, what inspired me to explore religion in my books, is part of it was the absolute inviolability, indestructibility of religion specifically in our culture, and how it's intertwined with politics, and how pervasive when those two meet, and they've throughout history and even today. In Western culture, and I work in the law enforcement legal sphere, and you think about Western cultures, where as much as we think, we've made this big shift, and AP is very right that I think that the default position is to fall back to conservative values. We made this big shift, and we've made this big shift between separation of church and state, and everything's now more secular, and now you can choose in court to solemnly affirm rather than swear on a Bible, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we're still very tied politically with politics, religion like this, the Constitution of the United States. I'm not picking on the United States, but let's look at how many people would refer to their constitutional rights as their God-given rights. There are certain intrinsic beliefs and values that are tied to religion and politics that are absolutely inescapable. And again, I'm not picking on any faith, any religion, any culture or country. There are places in the world, the Islamic states. How pervasive is religion in places where the religion and the people who run that religion are essentially the power structure and dictate not only what they believe the moral fabric of the state should be, but whether or not you can walk down the street without a veil or not, right? Whether you can go to any other school other than a religious school of the dominant faith. There's what has always fascinated me is how religion and politics and the power structure, as HL referred to, that specifically is tied to religion, how that continues to dominate in so many ways, or even our modern life. And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And how is it used? And I think for me, the issue always is about extremes, right? I think for a lot of us, moderation is the position. We'd all like to think of ourselves as being nominally, I think a lot of us somewhat moderate in our views, tolerant, open-minded, embracing of other cultures and other religions. But when you break it down to brass tacks and look around us at the structure, the political, the social structure of where we live, most of us, especially in Western countries, there are a lot of contradictions there. There are tons of contradictions there that we conveniently ignore sometimes because, as Laura said, we're so conditioned to think a certain way. Laura talked about students that aren't even aware there's another religion outside of Christianity. Well, in some cases, it's scarier when you are aware, but you choose to totally put that aside and to a fault and not entertain that there can be another way of thinking, another religion, and that's where, for me, religious intolerance and an inability to appreciate other religions. That's one of the reasons why I write, and that's what I write about, and how that seed germinates that only I know the right way. And if you aren't following my way, which is the right way, there's something wrong with you. You're flawed, your religion is flawed, your thinking is flawed. And that's one of the reasons why I write. And that's one of the things that fascinates me.
Yeah.
Philip and I talked about this not long ago because he very graciously had me on his channel. And we were discussing how people who are quite zealous about their faith actually have more in common with a staunch atheist than they would maybe like to admit, and that both people are very unrelenting on their stance. And it's fascinating in terms of listening to you talk about how politics and religion are so intertwined, because I don't live in Canada anymore. I'm a Canadian expat. I live in the States now. But in Quebec, there is a French party, a political party that runs on secularism and is very anti-religion and has gained quite a staunch following because of the fact that it is so anti that. And you're now starting to see responses to that because that has been the norm in place for so long. So it is interesting that you've had this existence of this for such a long period of time, that now the reaction to that is coming about in the same way that the general reaction to zealotry is coming out, and that we have a lot of people that are very anti-religion and are very vocal about being very anti-religion. So it's this balance.
No, another interesting aspect of this is we, and I say we, I mean probably somewhat secular Western people, tend to assume that wherever religion is pervasive, that there's intolerance. But I lived in South Asia, where religion is really pervasive, and their tendency is to be more absorbing of other. They'll say, "Yeah, sure, Jesus, he's one of us. Yeah, you're good." And that's Hinduism and Buddha. In fact, Hinduism and Buddhism in Nepal, you can't tell if you're sometimes in a Buddhist temple or in a Hindu temple because they blend so seamlessly. So there's a tendency there to absorb rather than subdue, I guess, is the difference. But you can have a pervasiveness of religion and faith that does not include intolerance. That can exist. And that's another facet of this, I think, that we often forget over here.
I think that's a very good point that you're making there, Philip, because I was wondering as well, the more and more this conversation here is progressing, no? The 6 people sitting here, we are all from Western countries, no? So we are probably by definition already a little bit blinkered, no? In what we think religion is and how religion functions. I also wanted to come back to what AP said about things getting more and more simplistic. And I think it links in very much with what the point PL was making about power and religion going so well together and being so intertwined, because a lot of religions, of course, give us rules to live by. And when I was kind of like looking around a bit and preparing for this discussion here, one of the things that I found out is that a lot of languages use the word that's also used for law for religion. That goes for our word religion as well, which comes from Latin. No? So law and religion seems to, right from the start, have gone hand in hand. And of course, religions also help you to simplify your life, because you have this set of rules that tell you, no, what to eat, how to dress, and so on. So yeah, I found this quite it's quite a fascinating and complex thing that we're looking at, no?
But I think that when you talk about that, and I if you'll forgive me, Philip, for using your wonderful Dan trilogy as an example, that when you talk about having that template for guiding your life in terms of religion, for having these rules for religion, religious precepts and tenets being synonymous with law, that holy wars. So a holy war isn't just, when we think of a holy war, we tend to think of the actual combat, the physical combat. But a holy war is waged on many different levels. It's physical, it's verbal, it's emotional. And it, as I said, it arises when one side believes that there is the answer and that there should be law, as you're saying, and that there's only one way to worship, and that all the trappings around their faith, that their hierarchy is the only one that makes sense. And it excludes people of different faiths or non-faiths, and all these people are labeled apostates or idolaters, and as AP said, the others. And the othering is that, if you're saying, okay, well, these are the rules of society, if you don't follow, you are the other. If you don't follow, you are the apostate, you are the idolater. When there's no middle ground, that's where the danger lies. When we believe that we have to forcibly convert and destroy. And that's something that Philip explores exceptionally well in his series. This struggle that, and I think Philip said himself, you're trying to preserve the best elements of not just faith, but organized religion, which is this force for good in so many ways, while you're trying to reject the evil and the perversion that people use religion to shield or justify these inhumane acts, right? And we have to realize that when we're saying, well, this is a rule and we're setting it down, and why? Because our religion tells us to do so, is that our own infallibility, and I think Laura talked about that, and our impurity of, and this includes the people who are responsible for the religion, the people who are making the rules, right? And there's just this inherent danger when we think that we know the right way, as I said, and we can set down these rules, with impunity, based on what we believe in. We have to always question and examine these things, and if we don't, that's, I think, where the danger lies.
I agree, and sorry that I keep going back to the Romans. And whenever I think of like our Western traditions, that's where I fall back to. But when you talk about law and religion and structure being so intertwined, to be a Roman meant that you had privilege and rights, and to be a Latin meant that you did not. And that was something that everyone coveted who was not Roman. You couldn't inherit if you weren't Roman. In order to have a will, you had to be Roman. And that meant that you partook in specific festivals and traditions, and you worship certain gods at this time of the year. And when Christianity came in, it really at its core was a very good thing for a lot of the other in that society, and especially women, because women at that point, you were told by this age you have to be married and you have to be producing children, and the lifespan of women was very poor. And in terms of the general lifespan of people in Rome itself was also very poor. And then you brought in this faith that said women don't have to get married because they can be married to Christ, which then offered this whole group a new opportunity. It offered people actually, for some reason, started taking, the Romans were very good with cleanliness in terms of bathing and all of that, but Christianity took it to a whole new level where lifespan started increasing within the city of Rome. So we see here that there are, at its core, things that are very good with the introduction of religion and starting to allow to incorporating the other and not being as divisive as we are and being more flexible. But it's like we were saying earlier in terms of how that then gets misconstrued when you then start having structure come into place and levels and seniority. So I agree. It's so fascinating when you just look at how religion and law have been manipulated with one another, and how at their very cores they were separate, but they just blended.
Would you then say that, for example, I mean, we were talking a lot about, simplicity on the one hand, but also then this imposing of one's own rules and one's own religious rules on the other. Would you say that fantasy is perhaps an exemplary way of infusing all of this with more complexity again?
Well, I think possibly one of the reasons why religion is so popular in fantasy as opposed to in a lot of future science fiction is the assumption, particularly in the Western mindset, that the more society progresses, the more secular and materialistic it becomes. Therefore, there's going to be less belief. So if you're setting it in the future, and you have a religion in the future, but they have all of this advanced technology, that sometimes can create an element of cognitive dissonance. But with the common perception that fantasy is about the past, and you're creating, this is way back in a mystical time, when people still believed all of these things, that's the power of religion, and we see religions being used for that. Like even in relatively simple and almost simplistic fantasy franchise novels like the Forgotten Realms novels, they had the Time of the Troubles event where a bunch of the gods got kicked out of the celestial realm and they were physically manifest on Farron, on the planet, and they could influence it. They had a sphere of influence around them that was geographically limited now instead of all of their different temples. But it led to a bunch of the gods warring and a bunch of the temples warring, and some temples feeling that their god had forsaken them because the god had taken up residence in a temple 4 cities away, and therefore they couldn't access their clerical magic. That kind of story doesn't necessarily function as well intuitively in a science fictional setting, because we reach to that sort of mythological understanding rather than with the default of scientific materialist rationality for science fiction.
What would you say is the relationship then also between magic systems and religions?
That is a convoluted question.
the codification of rules, the desire for a simple set of rules. This is how the thing functions. It's a pet bugbear of mine, where anytime someone wants to talk about magic in fantasy, it's always, well, what magic system does it have? It's like, why are you trying to systematize everything? It doesn't have to be a system. That this, but as a default, we've fallen into this, and it ties into the mechanical nature of having default, understandable, simple, straightforward rules to create repeatable effects. And it is a loss, actually, of the mystical or the holy or the wondrous, where you could have the miracle, the miraculous. That can't happen in a lot of fantasy now because, oh, well, that's just a deus ex machina. And, well, that's bad writing. It depends. Just labeling the fact that a holy force has come down to influence them. Oh, well, I just meant it as a bad thing. But again, it's the drilling down to, I Googled this, here are the 10 simple things that came with this. Here are the highlights. Here are the reductive notes on it. And so a magic system takes something wondrous, miraculous, maybe complex and contradictory, and go, but I'm going to make it simple and straightforward and repeatable for you. Just like, how do I live a good life? Philosophers have been debating this for thousands of years. What is good? What is evil? How do we differentiate? I know. Here's 10 rules. Follow these 10 rules, and that's all that you need to do. Oh, well, actually, I've now thought up another couple, so I'm going to add those in. Oh, well, I don't like that kind of behavior going on there. Let's add in another couple of rules. And it gains complexity over time, and ultimately a lot of them are contradictory. But the idea of rules and managing things, narrative and fiction is already a simplified form of understanding of what is going on. It is already simplified. Yeah. And reducing it down further with those things can be great. But I think that's where it's an excellent comparison of taking the miraculous, or what could be perceived as the miraculous, and systematizing it and creating discernible, concrete, specific rules that if I do these things, I can create a fireball, I can create ice, I can fly, because I have followed the rules employed in this. And it's a similar sort of thing, that let's have everything neat and tidy and controllable.
Yeah, in my case, the magic in the world that I've created is very much based on Buddhist philosophy. And it's one of the reasons why, if I'm asked to describe my trilogy in 3 words, I just say it's Beowulf meets Buddhism. So it's premised upon the understanding of oneself as connected with a lot. AP is distracting me in the comments. No, it's not cheese, AP. Oh dear. It is premised upon the understanding of oneself as connected with not just your immediate surroundings, but with all of life, and that our individuality is fleeting, that this identity that we carry around and we think is very important is in fact a very short-lived thing, and maybe even an illusion in some ways. But that doesn't mean that the magic cannot be Idam is holy. That is so good, AP. I had to repeat that. Does Idam cheese have holes in it, like Swiss cheese? I don't know.
Yes, it does.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. So anyway, what was
but that might also be a very simplistic way of seeing cheese, no? So
I think so. Very single-minded. But anyway,
where are you going with all of this, Philip?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that the magic can still.
Magic.
The magic can still be appropriated by the more aggressive religions, and they can repurpose it and define it in their own terms. So yes, in my case, magic is very directly linked to religion and philosophy, and it is the case in the less tolerant cultures of the world that I've created, that if you have magic, there's a good chance that someone's going to come knocking on your door and say, hello, it's time for you to be instructed now. And if you can't really say, well, I'd really rather not, it's not really an option in that kind of a culture, because obviously access to magic is power. And when religion becomes an apparatus of the state, then you're talking about an entity that is gathering more power to itself quite deliberately.
I find it so interesting because I never really thought about it until AP said it, that it is so systematized, and people often ask the question, do you prefer soft magic or hard magic systems? And I just never really thought about it in that sense. And Philip knows I love this book. I talk about American gods at absolutely every chance that I get, so I'm going to throw it into this conversation. But I feel like that is such a unique story in that you have magic, but it's fueled by faith, in that people are only as strong as their believer base is. And I feel like stories like that have become so few and far between because, like what AP was saying, it is very systematized in that we want to go into a story where we know there's going to be like Sanderson levels of magic that are going to be very laid out for you and repeated throughout the story, so you remember what they are because there's a million rules. Or you might have something like Guy Gaffer, okay, where it's very minor and subdued in the story, and then you have something like Neil Gaiman that kind of falls in the middle. And I feel like those middle ground stories have kind of fallen to the wayside in the last few years, which is a bit unfortunate because it offered more of that balance where both parties were involved, but only one was able to do these almost miraculous type things. And that's, like he said, it's become fewer and far between in our fantasy stories.
But there's an interesting point. What's the difference between magic in a fantasy world and a divine or clerical power in a fantasy world?
I personally don't view one.
But there, in a number of them, you have, if you think of the number of stories in which the study of magic is, you go to a magic university or a magic school and you learn how to use magic. Yep. But if you're a cleric, you go to the clerical thing and your magical spells that you do are prayers to your deity that the deity then performs the act. So it's miracles on demand as long as you use the right form of prayer and you do the right thing. So that division that they kind of had in Forgotten Realms, and then it's kind of revealed that Mystra, the god of magic, that actually spells are just prayers to her, and that's what spells are. So it's all kind of clerical. And then they go, well, no, we're going to change this again. And as the system has evolved and become more complex, you have demonic entities and entities that can provide power because they live in different dimensions, and people who instinctively or innately have abilities. But the idea that there's somehow a distinction think of it from a spectator perspective. It's like, oh, that's a cleric using religion to create a fireball. I'm okay with that one. Oh, there's a wizard using magic to create a fireball. If you're the person they're aiming the fireball at, it doesn't matter how they did it because it's the same sort of thing. But if you're the person creating the fireball, it's enormously important because one is associated with a religion and the other is the scientific or educational learned skill rather than praying to a god to create a fireball. So fantasy is really weird in certain respects as a genre in how it approaches the creation of the miraculous, what magic can do, and the fact that, oh, we're going to cite all these things off. And quite often, the magical abilities are linked to some sort of divine figure or the god of magic or beings with all of this power that they have given elements or shards of themselves to their followers who can then do these things, or it's a partnership with a magical entity. But when you come down to think about it, magic and religion, the creation of a miraculous thing. I have created fire out of nothing. I have called down lightning from the sky. This would have all been things that we associated with religion in the past. But in fantasy, quite often we make a distinction between the religious and the magical.
But I think, and that's an excellent point, AP. I think it's exceptional, those insights. In my books, what I explored was, and this is more from a traditional, more ancient context, is that delineation. That was the most important distinction in that, and who decides. If someone sees spirits, are they blessed by the deity, or are they heretics that practice evil magic? That needs to be so. And who decides? Typically, the clergy, the hierarchy. So if you have divine visions, and you see and you're visited by saints or angels, does that mean you're crazy? Does that mean that you're actually blessed? Does that mean that you're actually practicing witchcraft? We look at things such as the persecution and murder, essentially. You think about the 1600s, New England, with burning of people at the stakes, who practice, quote unquote. Well, a lot of people were saying, well, I was visited by God. I was visited by an angel. But suddenly that became heresy because you couldn't have been. But then the priest decides, no, but you could have been. It's just such an interesting contradiction in how we have defined what is, madness, heresy, versus, no, we sanction the fact that what you had was an authentic religious visitation, and we're going to canonize you and make you a saint, versus, no, but you're a heretic, and you're practicing witchcraft, and that's where, when you talk about fantasy and religion, how it's portrayed, I chose to take that aspect, in that the hypocrisy of my character and my characters, the clergy, feeling that, making that they are the ones who decide whether or not what you're doing is a genuine experience, this religious experience, versus, no, you're heretics and practicing witchcraft. And of course, the other religion is seen as being the ones that are the heretics and the ones practicing witchcraft. And of course, our religion, when our people get visited, but it can never be like that. So I think I explore that theme, but I think it's a fascinating one. So.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about what I've said in other contexts as well, that behavior without context is meaningless. So it's very much the context then that decides as well. Now, when is something a holy act, or is it, like you say, a heresy? And the context, of course, can be a cultural context, could be a psychological context. If somebody comes to a psychological assessment and says, I'm hearing voices, the psychologist or psychiatrist will say, schizophrenia, let's prescribe some medication here. So I think that the contexts very much define how behavior is seen, and also then judged, unfortunately. I mean, most of those statements are not non-judgmental. Let me bring then also perhaps HL a little bit more back into this discussion. The writer Aaron S. Jones has written in Grimdark magazine that he thinks Grimdark is particularly suited to deal with religion. And he thinks that's the case because, and that's a quote, religion can be divisive and spark uncomfortable conversations, but that is what fantasy, and in particular Grimdark, does so well. And examples he gives then are J.R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy. So is he right? Is Grimdark the ultimate religious fantasy playground?
I mean, I think it very much depends on your intention, essentially, and what story it is that you want to tell. I think it does play well into... Grimdark kind of already has an inbuilt audience who are willing to maybe probe a little deeper into the harder questions or the more difficult or more contentious subjects. So I think that having an audience who is willing to explore those themes does help. I don't think I necessarily thought I want to write a Grimdark version of like a religious story. I think I wanted to write a story that's interestingly, because PL talked about the link between politics and religion earlier, and I kind of wanted to look at that, but more the link between religion and corporatization. So I remember when I sat down to write this story, and I think the question I asked myself was, what would it look like if paganism or Druidism or Wicca, what if those religions had evolved to a kind of modern equivalent, what might that look like now? Would we be looking at corporate druids, and asking those sorts of questions? So I think with Grimdark, it's more about the audience, I think. The other thing I think as well is that not just with Grimdark, with all fantasy, I think there is a willingness to an extent to kind of suspend disbelief. I mean, obviously, people are going to suspend disbelief because they're reading fantasy. But I've no idea where I'm going with this. I've just lost my train of thought completely. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
It will come back to me, but yeah, and I just think it's a good way to explore things. So Laura mentioned earlier about Christianity and what it did for women, and how it changed that ability to go and join the church and find a new lifestyle. And what was great for me was when I wrote the Hallows, it was an opportunity for me to use those religious structures to put a matriarchal power system into play. And I don't know that I necessarily would have been able to do that in other settings. It would maybe in a sci-fi, yeah, it could have worked. But I think because we have that knowledge of that genuinely happening in history, to put it into a fantasy setting makes it quite believable.
Yeah. I want to just add, because we do have the privilege of having the Princess of Grimdark here herself, Miss Tinsley, that when it comes to Grimdark, and Holly is a fantastic Grimdark author, what struck me about the Hallows specifically, and how she explored religion, and again she used the corporate aspect as well. She deals with the extremisms of religion, and because I think in Grimdark, I think people expect dark, volatile, and some people expect controversy when it comes to Grimdark books. And I'm not saying Holly's book is controversial. I'm just saying that she so adroitly explores certain themes. For example, you have this group in the Hallows that they are totally against integration, and they want to bring things backwards. They want to regress because they feel that the integration with humans is going to essentially destroy the true religion and the true faith. And I think when you have Grimdark writers who can write really effectively the way Holly can, you can explore these subjects from somewhat of a safe distance. Do you know what I mean? And you can explore them almost ad nauseum, without feeling sometimes that, we're talking about, my situation with my faith and my beliefs, or what's going on in my society and my culture in real life. And I think that's one of the things I love about reading Grimdark, where we will always see these things that are analogous to the real world, but we can look at them with this almost detached lens, and talk about them and look at them openly. And that's one of the things that Holly is extremely skilled at in her books, and hence maybe why she's the Princess of Grimdark. But that's something that I really enjoy about Holly's books specifically, and threaded with Holly's typical extremely witty, on point humor, that very snarky, sometimes dry, matter of fact, British, very clever humor that you're looking at these themes that are they can be challenging, but that's one of the things that I love about her books.
I just want to say thank you, PL, for jumping in there. I apologise, my anxiety brain imploded just then for a moment. So thank you for stepping in, PL, and I very much appreciate you. Thank you.
Just to jump on the Grimdark train, I think what Philip was saying earlier in terms of having characters that do such deplorable things, but then can also inherently do good, is something that is explored probably in Grimdark more than other subgenres of fantasy. I know Abercrombie was one of the ones that was mentioned there, as was George R. R. Martin. I feel like George R. R. Martin gets talked about a lot more, so I'm going to focus more on Abercrombie. But Sandan Glokta as a character in his first law trilogy, he is the epitome of a character that does deplorable things and then at the same time saves people. And you look at that and you go, how can this be the same person? And he's part of an institution that, if you were looking at it from an outside lens, could very much be similar to a religious institution. He's an inquisitor. You know, Grimdark does that in a way where I feel like, because the nature of the story tends to be a bit darker, that you are allowed to, like Holly said, really explore those themes in a way that you might not get to in high epic fantasy or in a romantasy or anything like that. It's allowing you to get into that nitty gritty, darker aspects of characters and say, what makes you tick in the way that you do? But also on the flip side, what is good about you? And is there anything that's good about you? Because sometimes there's just not, and people are inherently not good people. But a lot of the time we are given this dichotomy with characters where there is a lot of good in and amongst quite a bit of bad.
Yeah, and I've Sandan Glock. It's funny you say, Laura. He's one of my favorite characters in fantasy literature. Period. I am just totally enamored of Sandan Glock. But again, I'm going to probably embarrass her. But Holly H.L. Tinsley's Vanguard. So John Vanguard. What I find about a lot of the when we talk about religion and fantasy, a lot of the Grimdark characters are characters. Not only they're immoral, not only they conflicted. They're characters I find that have lost their faith in something. It may not necessarily be religion. It may be their faith in humanity. There's someone who is struggling and trying and searching for themselves, and they're not sure sometimes what they've lost, but they know they've lost something that has to do with who they are and what their purpose is in the world and what they should do. And Vanguard, for example, is one of those characters where, again, doing things that would normally be considered bad to do good. But someone who still very much has a soul and has a moral compass, but that moral compass would appear twisted on the outside. When you write Grimdark, you can explore that. You can play with that in so many great ways, as Holly does, and as Abercrombie does with Glocta. This person's a torturer, and yet, right? He is Machiavellian and how he manipulates and schemes, and yet, and that's I absolutely love characters like that, and I think using characters like that, like Vanguard, like Sandan Glock, it's a fantastic way to explore those types of themes. But I do find that characters like that have lost their way, and frequently you see it's a loss of faith, and it could be a formal, like a faith, like formal religion, and or in themselves or in humanity. But I think they're all interconnected, though.
I don't think of it as grimdark per se, but I think that AP would agree with me, and anyone else maybe who's read Malazan, that Malazan, both authors, by the way, and maybe even more explicitly Ian Esselman than Stephen Erickson, but definitely both authors explore religion and faith and the dynamics. There's which one is AP? Is it Stonewielder? I think it's Stonewielder, where you have a really nuanced exploration of the role that religion plays in conflict. But all kinds of characters who've lost their faith, characters who are trying to assert it. It's just, Malazan has it all. And AP mentioned Thomas Covenant as well in the chat. But AP, do you want to comment on the Malazan series in this context?
Well, I appreciate that people were talking about Grimdark, but the use of fantasy as a way to provide a level of distance to examine complex or real world themes, but giving a safety buffer or barrier between the reader and an historical or knee-jerk reaction to a particular thing. That's not unique to Grimdark. That's not unique to any form of fiction. It's common in a lot of fiction. And when you have books like Lord Foyle's Bane, the Thomas Covenant Chronicles by Stephen Donaldson, like that, the lack of faith and that Covenant has, that he has failed in himself, leads him to do things, and then his inability to forgive himself, his inability to believe in the land. Like, these are all major aspects that have to do with self-belief, belief in the world and in what is right. But with the Malazan Book of the Fallen and with the novels of the Malazan Empire, again, not something that is typically described as grimdark, but taking that that lens and filter that fantasy allows as a safe distance to explore some contentious or difficult issues. And Guy Gavriel Kay does it in his work, although quite often borrowing very heavily from his actual history and creating the fantasization around it. But again, you wouldn't describe Kay's work as grimdark. And that to me is what a lot of the speculative fictions do, what horror can do, what science fiction can do, what fantasy can do, is it can take these things, these aspects of the human condition, these aspects of human society, and find a way to explore them, but using a potentially a literalized form of taking that metaphor and literalizing it, or creating a unique version of it that allows us that momentary separation between how we would react if it was actually happening in front of us to something that, okay, we're one step removed from it. So now we can actually think about it without that specific reaction in mind. And does that allow us a different insight into what is happening? And fantasy, science fiction, and horror all can give us that ability to step back from something and allow for the fact there may be one or two or a million ways to interpret what is happening, rather than, well, no, this is what has happened, this is what must happen because X, Y, and Z of my personal beliefs. So I don't think it's located specifically in Grimdark. I think this is the strength of what literature does. Literature helps us explore these things. And science fiction, fantasy, and horror quite often literalize metaphors, or they take something that is symbolic and use that as an actual thing in the world to explore. You see it in R. Scott Baker's Prince of Nothing work, the literalization of aspects of belief. And so that, I think, is one of the tools that the speculative fictions use that maybe we don't see as much of in literary fiction. But quite often then it's, oh, I want to talk about X war. Right. Well, I'll just change the names of the countries.
Yep.
You're still looking at the same thing. And, Joan Lingard, when I was a kid in Belfast, we had to read a book for school that was Across the Barricades, which was by Joan Lingard. And basically it was, I'm going to rip off the storyline from Romeo and Juliet, but I'm going to set it in Belfast. And it's going to be a Catholic girl and a Protestant boy. And you're like, right. Putting it in Belfast makes it no more or no less relevant than Romeo and Juliet was. Like, we didn't need it set in Belfast to be able to see that. Once you're taught to see beyond the superficial, once you can see and understand that level of abstraction of, well, this actually has a bigger point of connection. And I remember that being inflicted on me when I was a school child.
And you know what? You're right. It isn't just confined to Grimdark in terms of having that safe space to explore these themes. I would argue, though, that, and you're correct, that I have seen it best done in books that I would consider, and I know it's tough to classify and quantify what's grimdark versus what's dark fantasy. I would argue, and I'm certainly not the Malazan expert that you and Philip are, perhaps, I would argue that Malazan isn't grimdark, it's extremely dark. And, R. Scott Bakker, whether he's grimdark or not, it's extremely dark, philosophically dark on so many levels, brilliant, but dark. And Philip's book, I think perhaps a lot of people wouldn't describe as grimdark, but there's some very dark writing. Holly's writing, but Holly typically is seen as actual grimdark. I feel that it's the darker works that, just for me personally, and of someone like A.P. and Philip especially, who are a lot more well-read than I am, for what I've seen in my narrow reading, it's the dark books that do it the best, perhaps. And I don't know why that is necessarily. Is that part and parcel with that they feel the ability to go more in depth in certain elements and go places perhaps to that limit where it might be really, really uncomfortable to read, and to kind of make it in your face. I know that my books have been described as moral grimdark. And I don't know if that description is apt or not. It's not for me to say. It's probably more for the people that read it. but I think it's the dark books that do such a great job of really analyzing in depth and getting into the real nuances, and to a point of perhaps even discomfort, where you may have to put the book down, or you're like, you know what, I don't know if I can read this about this. It hits too close to the bone sometimes. But yeah, I don't know how you feel about that, AP, but
well, you also have satire. You have tragedies. Like these do it as well, and they've been doing it since, I don't know, like before the birth of Christ. Like drama has existed where we had this long before someone thought up 40k and then started the 40k rulebook with, the phrase where Grimdark comes from. Long before Grimdark was even a twinkle in a marketing guru's eye, that we have had stories of the darkness of the human condition, the exploration of the human condition. It's not limited in any way to a subgenre, because it's always going to be the authorial voice and approach to the narrative that they are doing. You look at something like the Short Timers, which is Vietnam War fiction. It was the basis for Full Metal Jacket. You go, that first person.
Have we lost AP?
momentarily.
Yeah, maybe.
Give him a minute.
Well, he's gone. I would like to briefly. Oh, there he is. You're back.
Yeah.
You were frozen there for a minute.
We lost you there for a moment.
How far had I gotten on a rant?
Pretty far.
Yeah.
Full Metal Jacket and
Okay, so Full Metal Jacket. It's not grimdark, but it's an exceedingly dark story. When you look at Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and now like more modern and postmodern critiques of it, looking at the inherent colonialism within it, but those works are not grimdark. They don't pretend to be grimdark, but they are stories that are being told looking specifically at that human condition. But to flip it, the Tough Guide to Fantasyland by Diana Wynne Jones had a companion novel, which is The Dark Lord of Darkholme. And that is comedic, parodic, and satirical. But it is so highly critical and satirical of colonial tourism. And it is incredibly pointed and sharp. And yet it is dressed up in happy, funny. You look at the work of Sir Terry Pratchett in a lot of the Discworld novels, where some of the most biting, insightful social commentary and satire is given to you with a smile and a laugh, because that gets us to pay attention to it, and it almost dulls the barbs as they go in until we don't realize that we've been pierced by them. That satire and comedy have done this as well. It doesn't necessarily need to be dark to analyze, critique, deconstruct, and challenge us with these things. But what I think Grimdark does is it does it very overtly and directly. It's going, this is the focus. So it's advertising itself to a reader for that type of thing. And therefore, potentially, I think there's more of a commonality of those things being explored, rather than it's the best venue for those things to be explored. Because that's where I feel that the quotation that was referred to earlier, that's where it went off the board for me. Because satire and tragedy and comedy can all be used and weaponized exactly to do those things. But there may be an expectation and an appreciation in the Grimdark readership for a direct examination, exploration of those things without any of the other approaches. But certainly, I don't think it is any better or any worse than the myriad of other approaches that smart writers have been able to utilize for the last couple of thousand years of narrative.
I apologize if you hear my daughter in the background, but just to kind of jump on that, Gilgamesh is our first written down story that we have found, and that is a prime example of tackling very dark themes and exploring what it is to be human. And it's something that is, like you said, it's gone on for thousands of years. I'm shocked if you can't hear her. But, it's just so interesting that yeah, kind of what PL was saying. Like, I think when I look back on the stories that I've read, I think the more prime examples of when I experienced that have been with Grimdark. But if you look at our history and literature, it's always been there in our stories. It's just you have to sometimes look for it a little bit more.
You're right. I mean, AP, he immediately I mean, can you get darker than Oedipus, right? I mean,
Yeah.
how much darker can you get than killing your father and marrying your mother? That's dark. So
I think R. Scott Baker can get darker.
yeah, he's pretty.
Tom Lehrer put it best when he said that Oedipus was just about a man who loved his mother.
Yeah, it's very sweet. That's very sweet. No, you mentioned R. Scott Baker earlier, PL, and I think he's a great example. This whole conversation could be about his series, The Second Apocalypse. I've only read Prince of Nothing. I'm going to be reading the later 4 books very soon, but it is very much influenced based on the Crusades. Obviously, the First Crusade is very apparent there. But the exploration of faith and what it brings people to do and how it is used, and you've got every facet of it there. You've got the true believers and you've got the cynical manipulators. So I think that's a series that really probably one of the most talented authors out there exploring this. I don't know if it's Grimdark or not. If you called it that, I'd be fine, but I honestly don't know.
Okay. Yeah. I think maybe we will wind it up with this now, with this insight that religion and especially darker stories have existed probably since humans are walking the world. Thank you everybody for being part of this discussion, and hopefully do a couple more of those. Thank you, everybody.